Hello everybody and welcome to a new edition of the show that is called Strange Times. I'm your host, Leopoldo Pérez Obregón, and I always forget to introduce myself, which is a shame because otherwise how else will you, the strangers out there, and me form the beautiful community that we are working to make happen here. As you know, this show works in the following way. We feature scholars. In this opportunity, it will be one scholar because it's one that can fill entire podcasts by himself to talk about the things that they are confused about. And then we go through a confusion of my own, mostly about the topics that my guests know very well. What is the confusion in this opportunity? Well, it has been very discussed lately about the lack of competitiveness of Europe lagging behind. What's the reason behind this? We talk a lot about these topics here at the UI and also at the Robert Schumman Centre of Advanced Studies, probably one of the most important, if not the most important center of advanced studies in Europe. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are very pleased to have with us today Erik Jones. Erik, welcome to Strange Times.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
No, I'm very happy that you're here. So we're gonna start with the classic questions that focus our show, which is, what are you confused about?
I mean, right now I'm really confused about where the world is going.
Well, yeah, that's a big one.
I look at all these changes in the way we think about trade and economics or money and finance. I mean, even just the internet, man. You know,
it's crazy.
I was talking to my brother and he was telling me that nobody is using regular search anymore. Everybody's getting it through AI. And that means you have to change completely the way you design a web page.
We have to change completely the way we sell our courses.
Hey, man, tell me about it. And then all the stuff we put on about the courses, we got to figure that out too.
I mean, that's most likely our biggest situation. But, and what do you think, Erik, I mean, of all of this situation in relation to the things that we do here? Because I just introduced this story of the competitiveness, of course. And I think it's very difficult to talk about this with regular folks, like tell them your problem is not migrants, you know, it's that probably we are doing something wrong in relation to our institutional setting. Like that is so unsexy to explain, right? Now something has been, let's say, been moving forward in the sense that some people say we need to build the United States of Europe. What do you feel when you hear that?
Hey man, I come from the United States. Right? You know, I'm very proud to be an American. I'm not sure that just because the states are united that necessarily makes everything work out good. So
yeah.
So I'm curious about this competitiveness thing, right? Because I've been around for a long time. And in the European context, we have had at least 4 different debates about competitiveness. And I mean completely different debates about competitiveness. And some of these debates make more sense than other debates. The debate we're having right now, which is a debate about total factor productivity growth, in other words, how do we get as much as we can out of the few people and the little capital that we got? And that's an interesting debate, and we can talk about innovation and what that does to total factor productivity growth. But this is the 4th time we've been talking about competitiveness, and this is only one iteration of the conversation. So I guess my confusion is, when are we ever going to get it right? Or are we going to fix this problem and we're going to come back and have a 5th conversation about competitiveness?
Of course, but what I meant with this story of the United States of Europe is that people say we need to move from a union to a federation of countries, which means also now this idea of the coalition of the willing, like Mario Draghi is moving forward on this pragmatic federalism, which means you guys, if you don't want to make the reforms, we're going to make them anyway. Go away to those who don't like to do them. We're going to move forward and we're going to get investment by making common rules. So possibly to make it simple for the audience, this means that when you have to do a business, you don't have to comply with 27 supervisors, 27 regulators. I don't know if that's as How would you explain that to a normal folk?
Okay, so I think we got to go back to the beginning, right? I said there were four different conversations. Let's go back to the first conversation. The first conversation sounds a lot like what you were talking about, Leopoldo. It was a conversation we had in the 1980s where European firms were looking around and they were saying, oh no, if I want to sell a lamp across Europe, how many different plugs do I have to put on it? How many different certifications do I need to get for this lamp? How many different technical standards do I have to meet just in making sure that the wiring is safe? And when you look at that kind of a situation and then you multiply it past every single consumer product, then you understand what the conversation was about in Europe, because the problem was that there were at least as many different rules for all those things that I just described as there were countries participating in the European Economic Community. So what they did is they said, okay, let's fix this. What we're going to do is we're going to strengthen the European Commission. We're going to change the way we make technical standards and safety standards and the procedures for harmonization or mutual recognition across countries. And that way we can go from having as many different rules as there are member states, call it 12 at the time, right? It changed. I don't want to make it more complicated, but as many different, and we're going to go down to one rule. Right? And lo and behold, that worked. And not only that, but they succeeded in
one rule. You mean the single market?
One rule, the single market. So you want a sheet of paper, you get it ain't 8.5 by 11 like we have in the United States, but it's A4, right? That's the one standard that propagates across Europe.
Yes.
And the point of this story, which I know I go on too long, but the point of this story is not only did they get the number of rules down to a manageable number, right? 1 as opposed to 12, but they also created a launch market. In other words, they increased the size of the European market to an extent that it could compete with the United States, so that when they innovated, they could put it out in the launch market, they could test it, and then they could perfect it, and then they could send it off to be manufactured in some other part of the world. This was the solution to the competitiveness problem of the 1980s. And by the end of the 1990s, Europe had a larger market than the United States. It had better regulations than the United States. It was the world standard setter in all of those things I talked about.
Yeah.
And you know what?
This famous Brussels effect that we will call it. Right?
Exactly. But you know what? That didn't solve the problem. It didn't end the competitiveness debate.
Because, I mean, not because then it would mean that there is one very simple explanation out of everything, but it's not really one rule, right? Even when we talk about the single rule book, that people will be confused. Oh, you guys have a single rule book of things for it. No, it's like 12 different regulations, and still it was somehow incomplete, because when you talk about one rule, what do you refer to, Erik? Because the only thing that is one and more or less is the single market, and in terms of services, we are way behind from being fully integrated.
So Leopoldo, I'm going to tell you two different things. First, you're too close to financial markets, because financial markets are at the end of this project, right? Yes. We're talking about goods markets. And in the goods markets, they've
my bias. You're right.
They've got this thing down pat. But the other thing, and this is equally important, right, is that that the European Union has succeeded in making it possible for firms to start up, do business, and comply with regulations relatively more easily than the credible alternative, which would be every country coppers the bottom of its own boat. And I'll tell you, my friend, that would not be a good situation.
No, that's
for
horrible.
Competitiveness in Europe,
for sure,
right?
For sure. But so you think that the capital markets is the last straw on this pile? Because I also don't want to disrupt your order, because you said 4 discussions and we're going to go back to this. But the capital markets in a way is, hey, Europe has savings, but we don't seem to be managing to channel those to make investments on whatever we need to be more competitive. So I'm not sure if this is the last straw, but it's my bias maybe.
So first, if I tell you all 4 competitiveness stories on the same show, you'll never have me back again. So I got to save some in reserve, man. But the other thing is, and this is even more important, they thought at the end of the 1980s that they could treat banks and insurance like any other industry. And what they discovered by the end of the 1990s is banks and insurance are different. And by 2007, they discovered that that difference is really important.
Tell me how that problem manifests. You can also grab the mic like Crypto Bro if you like it.
Oh no, because if I do that, I'm half Italian, man.
Yeah.
And then I'll just start waving the mic and I'll hit you with it.
You're half Italian?
Well, by this time, I've lived longer in Italy than I've lived in... Can't you tell from my accent? I've lived longer in Italy than I've lived in the United States.
I can imagine. I mean, your European connection now is very strong. We're going to talk later on about the transatlantic stuff. But tell me, what's this thing about the insurance and the banks that you tell me? Can you develop more?
Yeah, so, I mean, you know, and this is where you're going to go, oh, yeah, now he understood what I was saying, right?
Okay,
you know, if you think about banks, right? Banks have to meet requirements for stability that are very different from the safety requirements that we apply to manufactured products. And they're very different because they all work with different financial instruments. Okay, no, that piece of jargon don't work. So when you think about a pig market, right? In pig markets, you go and you buy and sell pigs, right? Mm-hmm. Bank markets don't work like that. When you go into a financial market, you're not buying and selling a thing, you're buying and selling a contract. Mm-hmm. Financial markets are buying and selling contracts. Every legal system has different contracts, and those different contracts are written according to different rules about how contracts can be written. So it's never, you're not going to look like, it's not like big pig, small pig. No, this is super complicated. And when you want to know whether a contract is safe and can be used as capital for a bank, you have to have legal system specific rules to govern what is capital in that financial institution. That's why you can't get it all into one framework.
We have more or less that.
You're getting there, but it's been a hard slog.
No, of course, of course.
And in 1988, 1989, they thought, well, you know, if it's good enough to be a contract in Germany, it's good enough to be a contract in France. It turns out that ain't the case. Mm-hmm. And so in the 1990s, we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to know when banks are safe if we don't even understand the contracts that they're using as assets on their balance sheets?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that an example of this comes also, I remember when we had this discussion in a seminar, because I was reading this book from Garicano, that he has this idea that we did this incomplete union in which we had a monetary union without a fiscal union, and then the way in which we closed the deal, let's say, was, for example, there's no bailout clause. So if you're a bank and you screw up, you're gonna go down. Nobody's gonna bail you out. So the threat was so big that we were supposed to be behaving. That didn't happen, and when there was a union, there was a you tell me if I'm misrepresenting the story later on, but all the debt from the European Union was perceived to be the same, this thing that you say, same contract, right? Debt from Greece, similar to debt from Germany. But then at some point, the spread started to widen. So basically, the investors trusted way less debts from certain countries. And this is what comes up as the European sovereign debt crisis, correct? Now, one possible diagnostic is, guys, we need better rules. We need to not allow the European Central Bank to be investing in government debt. And this is the main solution, right? More rules. But you will be not so sure about this diagnostic, I'm afraid.
So, God, I hope your listeners are drinking. Because this is about to get ugly,
okay,
right?
Go ahead.
So, the fiscal union piece that people talk about is not at all related to banking. So we're just going to set that aside, okay? The banking piece is complicated because of the definition of capital, but it's also complicated because some issues of some sovereign debt, right, are issued under national law, and some issues on some sovereign debt are issued under the law of the issuing authority, so it could be in London, right? If it's issued in London, then they're all the same contracts. So German debt and Greek debt is the same because it's issued in London and the contracts are the same.
But the credibility is not the same.
But that's a very different point.
But because some
That's a very different
governments are
point.
more prudent, others are more reckless. That's the whole point of the fiscal.
But that has nothing to do with the contracts, right? That has everything to do with the creditworthiness of the counterparty.
Exactly.
And here's the sticky part of the whole thing, is that what they said was to make it easier for banks to work. And this is not just in the European Union. This was in the whole BIS, Bank for International Settlements, banking, or what was it? Anyway, Banking Commission for Banking Supervision.
Yeah, Basel Committee for Banking Supervision.
Yeah, that's the one. Basel Committee for Banking Supervision. They agreed on a rule that said that sovereign debt in Europe, right, whether or not you're in the European Union, sovereign debt in Europe will all receive the same weighting when deployed as capital in banks. And that rule prevented banks from applying different creditworthiness tests to different sovereign borrowers, right?
Yeah.
And once you put it all in the same currency, because the single currency meant that Greek debt and German debt were all issued in the same currency. Once you put it all in the same currency, since it had the same risk weighting, right? And the same basic contractual form, and the rule said you should treat it the same, everybody treated it the same.
So you were saying that it's not that investors were dumb, the regulation encouraged them to put things in their balance sheet because they had to not, to put it simple for in discussion, the banks didn't have to hold more capital when they hold these bonds because they were supposedly not treated as equally risky by the regulation.
That's right. And again, that has nothing to do with the fact that there's no European fiscal authority. That has everything to do with the fact that you have a lot of different national governments that are issuing debt that gets treated the same way. By the way, this happens in the United States all the time, right? Because you get a tax advantage for borrowing at the state level. And the only reason that we don't have a no bailout clause, or that we have a no bailout clause in the United States, is because the states basically bankrupted the whole financial industry in the 1830s, right? So we had a long time to learn that lesson.
But you know, Erik, I come from, maybe I'm again biased by my own experience, but in Argentina we have a history of banks buying the central bank debt, which is something horrendous. Like, it means that basically the government can print endless money through this mechanism of, purchasing the public debt of the governments.
Okay, so
like, where's the moral hazard prevention here?
So
Governments can go crazy on this.
Yeah, but so then we have to clear something up again, right? Which is that if the bank is buying IOUs from the government, right? Mm-hmm. In other words,
IOU is a promise of debt.
Promissory note, right? So essentially, the bank is basically just opening up a bank account for the government, and that's bad, right?
Yeah.
So in the European Union, the central banks are not allowed to buy government debt directly from the government. They're not allowed to buy primary issue debt. They buy it on secondary markets, which means they buy the debt from other banks.
True. But that's why, I guess, you see every time that in the European Union, somebody wants to buy a bank that is sensible for the national interest, the Italians will say, and man, is this free market or what? Because they want to give more or less align their national banks with their fiscal, incentives to spend. Or what happens if all banks stop buying Italian debt?
Hey man, first, stop knocking on I told you I'm half Italian. It's the German government that's preventing UniCredit from buying Commerzbank, right? So it's not the Italians that are the bad actors in this story. It's innocent little Italians.
It changes over time, huh?
But and here's the other thing, right? During the whole period of quantitative easing, when the Germans were saying, we'll do this, but every central bank has to only take responsibility for its own country's sovereign debt, the Italians were like, okay, fine by me. They bought Italian sovereign debt in the worst part of Europe's economic performance, and the Germans bought German sovereign debt in the worst part of Europe's economic performance. And you know who lost money, hand over fist? The Germans. Mm. So it swings and roundabouts. By the way, how many Italian banks went bankrupt in the period from 2007 to 2012?
No idea.
Zero. Really? How many German banks went bankrupt, right? Lots. Germany spent more on bailout money the Italians get a bad rap in this story, right?
Yeah. Now, But tell me, Erik, you said 4 conversations. We are in the what is this moment that we are living? Because I mean, I only know this from the books, but you have more experiences. So
yeah, I'm old.
But tell me, how is this different from the previous ones, other than a rebranding? Before we said we are going to call it Capital Markets Union. Now it's the Savings and Investment Union, and we rebrand packages of regulations that never happened.
Okay, so there's a big difference, right? And you got to look into the coding. It helps to have very little social life, because then you can focus on the important reports that you're supposed to read. And if you look at the coding, what you discover is that what makes this different is in the completion of the internal market in the 1980s, the whole goal was to eliminate non-tariff barriers to trade, to liberalize the way all transactions take place within the European economy. And by the end of the 1990s, and it's not me, this is Thomas Philippon who says this, Europe's internal market, including the trade and services, was more liberalized than the internal market in the United States. Full stop, right? And that was the ethos. The biggest complaint about the United States is the United States has all these buy local provisions. State and local governments buy locally sourced services and goods whenever they can, right? Which is a huge distortion in procurement markets. Look at the Draghi report. What does the Draghi report say? Hey, you know what? Let's stop being so picky about state aid to industry. So we're going to activate industrial policy. That would never have been accepted in the 1980s. They were running in the opposite direction. And Draghi would say, let's ensure that any money spent on the defense industry, or let's include the dual use industry, falls disproportionately on European firms. So we're going to put local content requirements, right? That's completely antithetical to what they were talking about in the 1980s. And then, best of all, he says, okay, now let's do this, but add trade policy into the mix. So we're going to have industrial policy and trade policy working together to help foster European companies and innovation. This is totally different from the completion of the internal market. It's a completely different understanding of how the market should function in its relationship with the outside world and what it means to be competitive in that context.
But it's a bit of a mix, right? Going back to industrial policy together with, guys, let's complete the Savings and Investment Union, more or less.
Well, I mean,
And joint public debt.
The joint public debt thing we'll have to come back to in a second, and I promise we won't forget it. And then we can rehabilitate the whole missing side of EMU that you were talking about. But let's stick with this. The issue in this economy, this version of the European economy, is that they want to give more political direction to innovation and industrial development and trade. In the 1980s, it was exactly the opposite. They were trying to build a framework where they could get away from all of this. The big trick that the French used to do, which was called credit rationing or encadrement du crédit or whatever. And what it was is they would direct funds that were being channeled through the financial system and the parapublic banks to create credit subsidies for industrial investment in specific sectors. And it worked great until it didn't. And they said by the time the 1980s rolled around, it wasn't working so great. So they said, we've got to get away from this. That's why we had capital market liberalization in Europe from the French perspective. That's why the French were so eager to have private market for equities. So they did a big market liberalization in 1987. That's why the Germans were saying, oh yeah, I'm going to lean into that because we have an aging population and we have all these pensionable assets and we need to fund those in places that have higher rates of interest. So the Germans wanted capital market, the French wanted capital market liberalization, and that created the dynamic in the 1990s and 2000s that got Europe into trouble in an odd sort of way, right? But that's, again, still a different story from the common debt thing. And I argued for a long time that Europe should never have a giant common fiscal policy. Why? Because if you look at the most toxic debates in the United States, they are fiscal debates, where New York says that Texas borrows more and Texas says New York borrows more, and everybody gets all upset. And I can show you the data. The data is actually weird, right?
Okay.
So there's a logic to this frustration in the United States. But
what does the data say?
well, I mean, let me put it to you this way: the way the federal government allocates grants and aid to state and local government is often based on a matching principle. So if you don't match, you don't get any money.
Okay.
And that matching principle ramps up around social services like unemployment or healthcare, Medicaid, and Medicare. Medicaid is for poor people. So,
but matching, what would it mean? That they need to spend equally to what they
what they receive. So if you have a more generous tax system or a more encumbering tax system in a state like Massachusetts, and you pay more money to support people's health care, then you get more money from the federal government. If you live in a state like Texas, which has no state income tax and basically kicks people off of public health care, then no money flows into Texas for that thing. And so Texas is a huge net contributor on that basis, and Massachusetts is a huge net recipient.
But I think, Erik, that when we talk about European public debt, we are talking about some sort of what we call safe assets, so something that the banks can reliably buy to fund not random stuff, but to fund like infrastructure, like the things that we need to develop digitally, I guess. Now we are into that debate, like how do we get our own Google, Amazon.
But that's because you're a nerdy finance guy, right? Nobody knows what a safe asset is in the real world. And so there were three debates about Eurobonds in Europe. In the 1990s, Jacques Delors and the European Commission was talking about what you're talking about. And they said, you know what, we're going to raise debt in common to support investments in common, right? That's a familiar debate. Romano Prodi picked that up in the early 2000s. So again, you know, let's all borrow money together to spend on things that we're all going to benefit from. That makes sense. In 2010, there was a different debate about sovereign debt. And that was when they came up with the red bond, blue bond proposal at Bruegel, where the idea was, wait a minute, when a country goes bankrupt, should all of its debt go bankrupt? Right? Does that make sense? Because bankruptcy is kind of like an on-off switch. But the guy who bought the first piece of debt you issued, should they still be on the hook when you borrow at the end of the spectrum? Let me give you an illustration. So think of Ireland. Ireland had 27% of GDP worth of public debt in 2007, right? 27% of GDP. They had paid it down from over 115% at the start of the 1990s. So Ireland had basically done its homework. And you would think that holding Irish debt would be a safe thing.
Yeah.
But then the whole Irish financial system collapsed. And the ECB forced the Irish government not to bail in the depositors, but to bail out the banks. And so almost overnight, Ireland went from 27% debt to GDP ratio to about 110% debt, almost overnight. And all of that debt was regarded as bad suddenly.
Yeah.
So those people that were holding the first 27%, they got screwed, right? And it was by policy, and it was a policy that came from Brussels, well, Frankfurt, rather than from Dublin, right? And so then the question is, okay, why don't we do what credit cards do, right? And we give you a borrowing limit that we think is safe, right? Call it 60% of GDP, right? We'll figure out what your income is. We'll allow you to borrow in common 60% of GDP. That's
which
what
we have
Visa
more or
has.
less now.
But, I mean,
at the point we have this type of rules.
Well, we have this rule that threshold was borrowed from the Maastricht criteria, right? Yeah. And so you know, you get to issue that in blue bonds, right? And they have the same contract form, and they'd be issued in the same currency across all countries, right? So everybody would borrow at the same rate, and all of the countries that participated in this would have a joint and several commitment to pay it back. So it's just like Visa, right? Where you're paying a little bit, you know, on the margins, but you all get the convenience of having Visa, and it's relatively easy. Yeah. You know, short-term credit, very short-term. But in the red bond, blue bond case, the blue bonds would be long-term credit, and they would be continuously rolled over, and it would give governments a generous borrowing rate. Anything they borrowed above that, they would have to borrow using private debt. Not private, but national debt, right? National contract forms, clearly differentiated, so it would be much more expensive.
Yeah.
And think about what a good idea this is, right? First, we stabilize public finances in Europe because we make sure that everybody borrows responsibly with the money that we say they're borrowing responsibly. But then we create a strong financial incentive for them not to engage in excessive borrowing, because anything they borrow above and beyond that threshold has a very different price tag attached to it, right?
Yeah.
And the blue debt would be senior in the market to the red debt. Okay? So that was the second debate. The third debate was, well, wait a minute, if we had all this blue debt, think about the problems that it would solve. This would become the reservoir of safe assets that banks could use in the euro area or even outside the euro area when things got bad, right? People often ask me, and this is not something that was immediately obvious. This was not something that we even really understood in 2010, right? In the start of the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. The difference between Europe and the United States is that there is a flight to quality that goes from equity to fixed income, right? When there's stress in the markets. So people sell stocks and they buy bonds, right? So equity, stocks, bonds, fixed income. And then there's a ladder of quality for fixed income that they'll climb up, right? And in the United States, they climb and climb and climb and climb until they all end up in the same place, right? Which is holding U.S. agency debt or federal notes. And that influence is so strong that when the U.S. government got downgraded by Standard & Poor's in August of 2011, that scared the hell out of the market. And you know what happened? The price of U.S. government debt went up and the interest rate went down.
It's the best word possible. And yet, you guys in the U.S. want to get rid of the exorbitant privilege that it is called.
Well, okay, but hold on with me here. So we looked at that and we all said, hey, wait a minute. If Europe had that, that would be better than everybody selling equity and buying fixed income, so moving from stocks into bonds, climbing the fixed income quality ladder, and then stopping and saying, wait a minute, my safe asset is not as safe as your safe asset. And then they sell Italy and buy Germany. If you were to look at what happened in Italy in 2011, what you would see is in June of 2011, the market suddenly spooked. And between June of 2011 and December, they sold over 200 billion euros of Italian sovereign debt and bought German sovereign debt. And that completely wiped out the Italian economy.
But these are national bonds. It's not the same as a bond backed by...
That's why we said if they were all holding blue bonds... That wouldn't have happened. And so we came to that realization. And that was the third conversation about what we were missing, the safe asset conversation. That's the conversation we still have today.
So it's a bit of a zombie conversation again. It's coming back.
It's not a zombie conversation. It's pretty alive and kicking. I'm hoping. It doesn't bite things and then they all die, right?
I don't know if it's going to be convincing the Germans this time. But so then you said... Now we reached the third. The first one was standard single markets, like how to sell the same goods. The second one was because we started talking about...
Hey man, I have a lot of numbered lists, You're confusing the 4 versions of the competitiveness argument and the 3 versions of the fiscal sovereign debt argument.
We were talking about fiscal now. Okay. No, because it's true. But they are 2 different debates. But Erik, I'm wondering, because now we talk about the exorbitant privilege as well and these type of things. And when you go talk to your counterparts in the US, which I guess you, after living so many years in Europe and being here directing the Robert Schumman, they may consider your views as, we need to ask Erik. And what do you tell them, like when they say, like, we're mistreating these guys, so they better ramp up their spending in military and we don't have to cover their lazy lifestyle,
so
with too much vacation?
So this is a conversation we've been having for decades, right? And the arguments are subtle and complicated, but the easy version, right, is the Europeans would be happy to spend money on their security, but they want to spend that money on things that the United States does not want them to spend it on.
Okay.
And so we would get to that part of the conversation all the time where the Europeans would go, oh, we want our own headquarters and command control, communication, intelligence. We want strategic lift. We want, and the whole giant list of big assets. And the United States was done, no, we provide that. You guys spend it on other stuff, right? And that was not a compelling argument for the Europeans, right? Now, they should have been compelled. They should have looked ahead. There was a guy, his name is Bob Gates. He was a great Secretary of Defense, first in the second George W. Bush administration, then extended into Obama. Obama kept him on. When he left in 2011 is a watershed year for all of these conversations. When he left in 2011, he told the guys in the NATO alliance, he's like, look, if you don't spend this money, then it's going to be hard to defend you in Congress, right? And they tried. I remember in 2013 when Enrico Letta was prime minister in Italy and Italy had the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, Letta focused a lot of attention on defense industrial investments and dual use investments and mobility infrastructure, all the things that we're talking about today. It just didn't get a lot of the traction that we were hoping for. He didn't stay as prime minister very long. He got chucked out in February of 2014. And then there were a whole series of other issues, migration, things like that came onto the plate, right? 2014 is also when Russia annexed Crimea and everybody in Europe started to look around and figure out what they were trying to do. And there was a big division over how best to respond, right? And the Obama administration's emphasis was more on sanctions than on military buildup, and that turns out we probably should have done more military buildup than we did, right?
Okay.
So fast forward to the first Trump administration. First Trump administration came in and said, you need to spend more on defense. And the Europeans were like, oh, yeah, we were thinking about that. They started to spend more on defense. Biden came in, they spent even more on defense. Trump came back, now they're spending even more on defense. But this time the difference is that they're not listening to that argument about don't duplicate our assets. This time in the Draghi report and in Protect EU and all the big documents, they're actually focused on trying to replace American assets because they're worried that the United States won't be there. That's a conversation I'm having a hard time explaining to my American counterparts.
They think that we are just going to go back to normal.
Oh, yeah, man. I was just in D.C. and they're like, oh, come on, midterms, then another president, and the Europeans go, wait. And I said, well, look, building strategic lift, not to make a pun out of it, right? But that's a heavy lift. That takes a long time. You've got to invest for many, many years. They can't wait 3 years to see if they should start investing. If they're going to need strategic lift by 2030, they need to start now, right? And so they can't wait for the midterms. Who cares about the midterms? They've got to start building strategic lift. They've got to duplicate Starlink. They get their own, intelligence capabilities, better satellites. There's all this stuff that the United States doesn't want them to invest in the past. That's what they're going to have to invest in now, and that's what they're doing.
Where do you think this thing is going now with the transatlantic relationship, given how strained the things are? Because it's true, everybody mentions the midterms. Now you said the U.S. counterparts, but here we're also getting some, distrust, I would say. And some people I heard, I'm not an expert in international relations by any means, but they were talking about this thing of maybe some people believe that the Iran war is to the interest of the U.S. to keep it prolonging. So, I don't know, people fly more to the U.S. dollar and then they keep things going as they are. So as a way to maintain the status quo, how would you frame this moment in this sense?
Look, war and instability are always moments where disinformation and conspiracy flourishes. So, you could tell me that they think Martians started this whole thing in Iran, and I'd be, I bet somebody's saying that. I'm sure somebody's saying that somewhere, right? That it's space aliens who did it. the thing is that you need to bring stability back in order to get narrative control, right? And the Trump administration is not exercising good message discipline. The president himself is incapable of message discipline in this context. He's very disciplined in other contexts, but in this context, not so much. And so
I wonder where he's disciplined.
Oh no, he's really good at some things, right? And like putting people, he's thinking about this as a negotiation. So he's playing it like a negotiation. I listen to him and I'm just like, oh yeah, that's what he thinks he's doing, right? But and he's on message for that. It's just from the American people's perspective. This is very confusing. From the European perspective, this is beyond confusing. This is alarming, right?
No, yeah.
And everybody is looking at the Iranians and saying, okay, who is receiving the signals, the very clear signals he's trying to send? And what are they thinking, right? Because they're only clear signals for that elect group, right? The rest of us are irrelevant in these negotiations.
Yeah. Erik, I don't want to let you go without asking you about something that I'm very curious about. I've been thinking, which is this story of academic freedom. But I don't want to ask you what do you think about it, because it will be probably a boring answer. I want to know, how did you experience that when you were studying, like in the US, for example? I guess because this debate is endless, right? Like some people have one view, other people have another view. Then campuses are for that, I believe. But how did you experience yourself this in your personal career?
Okay, now you can hear I'm constantly jumping between different registers, right? Where I've got, I say things in kind of jokey, colloquial speech, right? And then when I get the sense that you're not really following what I'm saying in precise technical terms, I'll drop down into that technocratic register, and you and I will talk about free assets or capital rules or stuff like that, right? Yeah. That's how I grew up in the academy. Okay. In the sense that there were always two different registers. One register that was reserved for conversations among people who study a very specific thing, and another register that's available for the outside world or anybody who's interested, right? Because let's face it, most people would rather read the sports page than anything I've ever written. And in that context, academic freedom was, I can talk technical, I can talk fast and loose, I can back up my arguments any way I see fit. And if you disagree with me, then we'll jump from one register to another and we'll figure out where the disagreement is and how to resolve it, right? So that's the way it used to be. It ain't so easy anymore.
But because what is said that, for example, this thing of universities becoming this hostile place for ideas that we don't like, more or less started in the US. You would say that, or you would disagree, because when I was a student, I don't know, these things were not so. Yes, we had this. For example, abortion debates, I remember, were a thing that if you will bring an anti or a pro-abortion person, the Catholic guys that give money would be angry, but then it was not so radical, I would say. And it started in the US, I think.
I don't think it started in the U.S. I think it started in the 50s, right?
Started in the 50s, okay.
I mean, let's face it, there have always been, and university should be a place to challenge convention, because sometimes convention is not a good thing.
Wokeness is different, I would say.
No, it's just convention being challenged in a different way, right? But look, I'm not going to say people should be woke. I'm not going to say people should be unwoke. What I'm saying is that, if you were to challenge convention about racial equality in the 1950s in the United States or in Europe or anywhere for that matter, right, you would get a lot of pushback, like serious pushback. And yet, we now regularly have conversations where we accept racial equality. It's unusual not to, right? The convention has changed. And I think that's an important thing. gender conversations. My God, the university I went to didn't allow women until 1972. You were not allowed to be married if you were a university student. Give me a break. This is like crazy pants.
But
right?
You have to admit that now we are discussing things that we were supposed to be sorted out.
Well, I mean, human history is not linear. It's these conversations. It's good we go back to them. We should talk about them, right?
About if women should vote, that's what these guys from the far right are.
Come on, man. We need to remind ourselves why it was so hard for women to get the vote in the first place. We need to remind ourselves how many other forms of discrimination that women face. And we won't have that conversation if we go, oh, hey, done and dusted, women, it's all great.
No, of course, but the fringe is getting in the mainstream lately. Hard.
Good. That way we have more reason to push back. Right? I mean, what I object to is
like
not
how
that
liberal you are, Erik. I fear that these times that we are, but it's good to see that you're not scared about it, because to me it seems like crazy.
Dude, I am scared about people firing people for saying things that are considered inappropriate. And we need to start pushing back now and hard to make sure we never get to that point, right? Now, there are certain red lines, though. I'm going to lay it out there for you, right?
Go ahead.
I understand in Austria that they do not want Holocaust deniers on the public purse. I think that makes sense. I think in the United States, if somebody denies the Holocaust, you would really ask yourself a question: what happened in the hiring process, right? And you might remove them from positions that are public facing, right?
Yeah.
But if they're trying to come up with evidence, then the rational thing to do is to argue with them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and show definitively that just is not the way it happened, right? And that's what academic freedom is. Confronting ideas that make you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
In having conversations, even conflicts, right? That make you uncomfortable.
Totally. I think that protesting is also part of that. We shouldn't be that much afraid of it.
So let's break out the world into 4 different kinds of speech act.
I love your list.
Right? So there are some speech acts that I have no problem with. Okay. I'm arguing with you, you're arguing with me, right? Boom. There are some speech acts where I just assert my opinion, right? I got no problem with that. It ain't an argument. Are you going to tell me you know my opinion better than me? No, that's not an argument, right? There are some speech acts where you say, I am not going to listen to you, right?
Yeah.
I start to get upset about that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's healthy. And there are some speech acts where you say, your thoughts are not worth hearing. And I can understand the desire to say that. And yet, from arguing or stating your opinion or I'm not going to listen to you to your thoughts are not worth hearing, I'm not sure at the university that's where we want to go. I don't think we need to go all the way to DEFCON 4.
No,
right?
definitely. No. We, of course, made this line that you said, the Holocaust denier is probably where we draw the line, right? When the opinion of the other is denying the existence of somebody else.
Oh, dude, a Holocaust denier, I would put in DEFCON 1. I want to argue with that person because they're crazy, right?
Yeah.
And if the more time they want to spend arguing this thing, the more time I'm happy to push back, right?
I mean, I don't even know if I want to see these people on campus. I'm not sure. I don't have a stable position on this. But I mean, I'm in favor of people protesting, for sure. I'm in favor of people chanting if they had, as long as they allow other people to have their turn for doing their thing. Because also it's part of youth. People like to protest. People like to be against. You see, for example, we have this event, the State of the Union. Huh? For some reason, it got like hate against it, whatever. And then we canceled, we did another thing. Last time they were doing the alternate State of the Union. And now the event is not called anymore State of the Union. And yet I've seen posters of alternate State of the Union. So you will say, man, we changed to accommodate, certain things, but yet there's still a willingness to keep protesting. So I think that protest is going to exist no matter what you do.
Hey, man, that's also branding. They know alternate State of the Union will get people's attention. Right?
Yeah, of course. but we changed our branding, and now it seems they are even more nostalgic than...
You can call it New Coke if you want, right? But that doesn't get you out of the pop market. So.
Erik, so now we're getting the end, and this is the favorite part of the strangers watching this show, which is where we share the strangest thing that we saw this week, and then we rate each other's strangest fact to see who won, and then who wins gets the strangest prize. Those are the prizes you may get as a token of whatever we did here today. You will say, I won the strangest prize when I went to the show of Leopoldo. So basically my strangest fact is this picture. Have you seen it? I know it's very small, huh? We don't have a big screen, unfortunately. But this is basically Peter Thiel that went to visit Milei, and they brought this big chainsaw, which is, I don't know if the one that Elon Musk gave to him, but it was a big fuss that Peter Thiel was in Argentina. Peter Thiel was the co-founder of PayPal and friend of Elon Musk, who also created Palantir, which is the company that is now being used for surveillance in the US to do immigration raids or whatever thing you may want to call these things that they do with this technology. And it has been to me a very crazy story that Peter Thiel not only visits, he wants to know that he visited, and he bought a mansion in a fancy place of Buenos Aires. And the question is why? And there are lots of speculation. But I find very strange in this moment that these influencers of the far right, of the fringe, becoming mainstream, as we just talked, seizing the power strains all over the world. So, what do you think about this Peter Thiel guy? Have you seen the Palantir Manifesto, all these things that we have been discussing?
So, I'm not... There are a lot of strange things about Peter Thiel. Yeah. And about the things he thinks and writes, right? Well, I don't know what he thinks, but let's say the things he writes and says, right? Yeah. I think it's important to engage with those ideas. I don't think he's a stupid person by any stretch of the imagination. I think he's smart, so we should engage with those ideas. But I think we have to engage with those ideas in ways that help people better to understand the world as it operates. And I'm not sure that on many levels he and I share the same perception of reality.
For sure.
And I don't say that lightly, because I think there are strong structural reasons why somebody who has so much money they could randomly buy a giant mansion in a nice neighborhood in Buenos Aires, right? His whole travel experience getting down there would be fundamentally different from mine, right? I don't
Not
think,
a halter, right? I'm gonna buy a mansion.
I don't think, I don't think his reality is my reality, and I think that's unfortunate. Our wealthy people have become so wealthy, they're completely unplugged,
totally,
from our day-to-day existence. And that gives them the freedom to say things. And by the way, they're not easy to argue with, because they'd go to DEFCON 3 immediately and just go, I'm not going to listen to you. I got billions of dollars. I got more important things to do. I'm out of here, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so, you can't get their attention. They're not going to listen to anything they don't believe. They're going to say anything they do believe, no matter how crazy it is. I don't think that's strange. I think that's not good for our society.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's deeply disconcerting, particularly when they're trying to, and this is where Peter Thiel becomes really important, redefine our ethics.
Mm-hmm. Because the guy, just for context, for those who don't know who this guy is, he studied philosophy, something like that, and he writes books and he has some conceptual framing. He was already a reactionary of the alt-right when all of Silicon Valley was progressive. So this guy was always following the same line of thought, and now he built this very evil technology to do bad things to citizens and overcome their rights, basically. Overcome democracy, too.
I mean, look, the technological universe we live in right now, I don't know, you may have Palantir on your phone and I've got something else on mine, right? I mean, they're probably talking to each other. Who knows, right? I'm uncomfortable. I choose to be comfortable, but I'm not comfortable at all.
That's a good answer. And what's your strangest fact of the week?
My strangest fact of the week, I've got two. First, I went to a meeting at a think tank in Washington where we're talking about populism and the transatlantic relationship, and it was really interesting conversation, and there were great staffers from the Hill that were there to participate in the debate. And the spectrum that we were exposed to ran from the far left to the progressive center left.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh no, we're talking in a box, right? They're great guys, they're really smart. But if we're only talking to each other, why are they spending? I didn't realize that I was going to be talking to the echo chamber on the center left. Yeah. I don't feel uncomfortable there. I'm more likely to find agreement there than anywhere else, right? But that's not going to move the needle. And by the way, if it's not moving the needle for me, why is it moving the needle for them? I don't think it's moving the needle for them either. So is this just one big therapy session?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's so strange, but
it's not strange,
but it's a different kind of discomfort.
Yeah, definitely. But don't worry if it's not strange, because worst case scenario, it's the time where we take out the strange-o-meter. So we have Erik and Leopoldo, and we rate our strange facts. So your fact was, I will put you. Echo chambers are not very new, so I will give you a 6 because I'm very kind and you're my boss. And I'm going to give my strange fact an 8 because it's my show and I also overqualify myself. So now it's your turn to rate my strange facts.
Oh, hey man, your fact is way stranger than mine.
You have your numbers there too.
Oh, just because you've got Peter Thiel, right?
Okay.
So you get 89, and I'm gonna say my fact wasn't strange at all. So I give myself a 0.
So I'm earning this time the prize of the strangest prize, which I'm gonna choose. And I didn't show to the audience what's the prize about, which is, for those of you who could not see, we have a crazy angel, a car, a coliseum, a fish, a weird podcaster. So I think I'm gonna go with fish. That's my strangest prize. Erik, you choose the less strange prize for your remembrance.
Oh, wow. Well, the less strange prize has got to be the Coliseum.
Amazing, Erik. Thank you for coming. It has been great talking to you.
Great talking with you, Leopoldo. Thanks for having me over.
Thanks.